So if you're not an English major, I give you permission not to watch this video. Uh, this is critical strategies or literary theory. It's something that's kind of fallen out of favor, I think, because it takes a lot of a lot of hard work and intelligence to try to understand these different theories. But they're an interesting way of looking at literature in different from different perspectives. So literary theory really kind of sprang up as an area of study in the 60s and 70s. And like I said, it's kind of fallen out of favor now. But there's different ways to actually look at literature. So the first thing that we saw with this was something called the New Formalists. These are also known as the New Critics. Uh, when I first heard about them, I kind of freaked out because I really didn't understand how they could do this. But what they do is they just look at the text. Everything else that is extraneous to the actual words on the page do not matter to the new formalists. So nothing outside the work actually matters. So, you know, the biography of the writer, the times when it was written, uh, nothing matters. And they primarily were looking at poetry, not so much short stories or novels or plays. And so here they really put a lot of emphasis on what particular form the poem took and what words were actually used. I think it's kind of a restrictive way to look at literature. I think it ignores an awful lot of factors that really should be taken into account. But again, I'm coming from a 21st century view of literature and not, an early 20th century. Now, the other, and another theory is deconstruction. This is known as post-structuralist criticism. So structuralist criticism looked at, with like the didn't spring from the new formalists, but along with that idea, looked at the structure and what was at the center of the structure and what came out from the center of the structure, and specifically how those structures were put together and then ended up being used to interpret what was going on. With deconstruction, we're looking past that structuralism. Derrida, who's the father of this, didn't feel that structure played a role or that structure even existed, that everything was fluid. And so one of the things that he gets misinterpreted for or misquoted as saying is that there is no meaning. He never said there was no meaning. He says language and meaning is not fixed, that it's fluid and it changes as you go along. And that there is no coherent meaning at the center of anything. This does not mean that there isn't any meaning, however. Uh, what he was talking about is that so like if you look in a dictionary, look up a word for a meaning, what you find are other words that you also have to know the meanings for, and so the meaning keeps sliding along what's called this chain of signifiers, with the words kind of being a signifier. But that's what they're talking about there. Now, with archetypal or Jungian criticism, this deals with a guy named Carl Jung, who was at one point Freud's assistant, Sigmund Freud's assistant, and they had a falling out, I think, over Freud's daughter. But Jung went in a completely different direction, where he started studying heavily Asian philosophy, Asian religion, and he came up with this concept of the collective unconscious, that he believed that all of us were born with a collective unconscious. And this is then expanded by a guy named Joseph Campbell. Well, and the hero's journey. And what Campbell did is he studied all the different myths throughout the various cultures of the world, and he saw that one myth kept showing up again and again in all of these cultures, and he called it the hero's journey, uh, where a hero has to go on this journey into this strange land and bring back this magic elixir, for better word. It's not necessarily an elixir, but this boon to the rest of humanity. And what he thought it was that this is a psychological journey that people would have to go on in order to become mature adults and contributing adults to their society, and why he thinks this motive occurs across all cultures. And so with archetypal or Jungian criticism, we're looking at archetypal plots and characters. So these characters and these plots that occur throughout cultures that aren't just relevant to a single culture. And so they may take different forms, but uh, they are basically the same story. Now, historical criticism is something that I think is very important, is you place the text within its historical context. And so what you're looking at there is when was the work written? Because the writers are being shaped by their current society and by the position within that society. So we'll look at gender criticism a little later with feminist criticism. The women who were writing in the 1800s, uh, such as George Eliot, that had to take on a man's name, or in the late 1700s with Jane Austen having to hide the fact that she was writing. Uh, this shapes then how you interpret the work itself. And you've also then got biographical criticism, which is self-evident that the biography of the writer. So, I mean, Walt Whitman writes an awful lot of poetry about the beauty and the stature and the human spirit of man. And it's heavily influenced, I think, by the fact that he's a homosexual. His love of man itself isn't just a pedantic type of love. It goes deeper than that, and I think you have to take that into account. All right, now another, and this is a criticism that still holds sway. It holds sway more in Europe than it does here because we're so anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-Marx, where they're not so much in Europe. But with Marxist criticism, they're seeing literature as being a product of economic forces. And so Marx established this theory of the base or the infrastructure, uh, which are the systems in place of a society, of the means of production, who owns those means of production, how things come into effect. And then the superstructures, the ideology of the law, the politics, and the literature all support and propagate the interests of the dominant class, is what he's saying. And so Marxist critics are looking at it as being a way to hold power within literature by who gets to publish and who doesn't get to publish, what gets to be published as far as what is said. I mean, we've had banned books in this country forever, and then Marxist criticism would kind of look at that and say, well, what wasn't banned and why wasn't it banned? Uh, and so there's sometimes a focus on the literature of what it does not or is not allowed to say. Uh, to a large extent. And so sometimes you're looking at literature that doesn't get published, and why doesn't it? Now, with new historicism, uh, this is kind of strange. It says there's no actual history. There's just simple our version of our past. And so you can kind of see where they have a point there, is that each culture sees its history differently than a culture outside it. For an example, if we were to look at the Vietnam War, we would see the Vietnam War very differently from the Vietnamese. And so what they're saying is there's no real history that is shared by all people. We just each group shares its own history, and it's just their version of how they think things went down. And so history is just reflecting our own personal preferences. So a good example of this is colonialism in Britain, uh, where their history books showed it as being a wonderful thing for the people who were colonized. And it wasn't until the 1980s that they started to come to grips with the great damage that colonialism had done to cultures outside of Britain. And you still have places like Belgium that still have not come to grips with what their colonialism did, especially in Africa. And so they take this into account as they theorize and interpret literature. And then you have psychological criticism. So this is the author and the writing viewed through the lens of either Freudian psychology, you know, and maybe looking at Oedipus complex, that type of thing, and the Lacanian psychology, which Lacan kind of built on Freud and went off not in a different direction like Jung did, but kind of tweaked what Freud had to say. And so he's more interested in something called the rule of the father and how the patriarch plays into things, into how things are seen and perceived within, and how people's psychology is developed by the father figure. Not so much with the Oedipus complex like with Freud, but more on where different genders, the male and the female, actually view how they view society. And they're looking at what repressed desires are being brought to the surface. This is one of the things that when somebody writes, if they're writing honestly, it's kind of scary because they are allowing you to have a view of their unguarded subconscious and of who they actually are. And a lot of times writers will say that things come out about themselves or that they didn't know existed because it is allowing the subconscious. And so you tend to look then at the characters represent any of these repressed desires or any aspect of the writer that possibly the writer wouldn't want you to know about, that type of thing. Now, finally, we get to gender criticism. So there are different types of gender criticism. You have the feminist criticism, and so feminists are looking at whether women write and read in different ways. They're also looking at how women are represented in literature, especially when they're written by men. And are the representations of women different when female characters are written by women than when they're written by men? And so feminists tend to focus on that. They also do focus on, along with Marxism, feminism, feminist criticism tends to be closely aligned with Marxist criticism because they're looking at how women have been suppressed throughout the ages via literature and by being excluded from being allowed to write literature. And so they look at the canon, the canon is that collection of literature that we say represents like Western literature. What are the great works of Western literature, which are primarily written by men? And they're saying it's established and dominated by men, and therefore we have to look at an alternate literature. So what happened in the 60s and 70s, and it's kind of grown from there, is that we don't look just primarily at novels, plays, and short stories now. Diaries, because that was the only thing written by a lot of women for a long period of time, tends to be, or letters tend to be considered now literature because it allows us to have some representation of women within the literature from a time when they had no chance of ever getting anything written. Now, along with the gender criticism, you have other things such as lesbian and gay literature, and this grows out of the feminist criticism. And what we're looking at is, do lesbian and gay writers write and read differently? Are they concerned with different topics, different subjects? I mean, they're also seen as a suppressed minority, and they tend to be more activist at times. They're trying to change society's view with the literature itself. All right, so there's a short like intro to this, and again, uh, all of this you can take entire courses on in any one of these theories. You can do an entire major in it, I think, in your master's. But I find it interesting. It's different ways to actually look at the literature. It gives you different uh, ways to come at it and to interpret it.